Sit down for a moment and forget everything you've been told about what it means to be normal. Because this isn't about being antisocial, arrogant, or someone who simply doesn't like people. This is about something much rarer, a mind that doesn't automatically move with the crowd. A mind that can sit alone with an idea for hours while everyone else has already moved on. A mind that questions what everyone accepts, notices what everyone ignores, and would rather be misunderstood than pretend to believe something it doesn't. If you've spent your life feeling slightly out of step with the people around you, there may be nothing wrong with you. You may simply have the mind of a lone wolf thinker. And the strange thing about this kind of mind is that you usually don't recognize it as unusual because you've been living inside it your entire life. You think everyone notices the contradictions you notice. You assume everyone questions the motives behind people's words. You assume everyone needs time alone to process what they're experiencing. Then one day you realize they don't. Most people aren't examining the structure beneath the surface. They're responding to whatever is loudest, newest, or most socially acceptable. And that's when you begin to understand why you've always felt different. A lone wolf thinker isn't necessarily someone who lives in complete isolation. That's the stereotype, and it's wrong. You can have friends, a career, a relationship, a family, and still possess a profoundly independent mind. The difference is that your identity doesn't depend on constant agreement. You don't need a crowd to tell you what to think before you allow yourself to form an opinion. You don't automatically accept an idea because 10 people around you believe it. You don't abandon your judgment simply because disagreement makes the room uncomfortable. And you don't confuse popularity with truth. Your mind has an internal checkpoint, and everything has to pass through it before you accept it as your own. That can make you slower to follow, slower to trust, and sometimes slower to speak. But it can also make you unusually difficult to manipulate. Because once you've thought something through for yourself, social pressure loses much of its power over you. Sign number 1. You naturally question what everyone else accepts. This isn't about being contrarian just for the sake of being different. In fact, genuine lone wolf thinkers aren't constantly arguing with everybody. They don't need to announce that they're rebels. Their questioning happens internally. Someone says, "That's just how things are," and your mind immediately asks, "Why?" Someone says, "Everybody knows that," and you wonder whether everybody actually knows it or whether everybody simply repeats it. Someone tells you that a certain person is bad, and instead of immediately joining the judgment, you want to see the evidence. Someone tells you that success requires a certain path, and you start wondering whether that path actually makes sense for you. You don't reject ideas automatically. You examine them before accepting them. That's a very different psychological pattern from rebellion. A rebel needs opposition to define themselves. A lone wolf thinker doesn't. If the crowd is right, you'll agree with the crowd. If the crowd is wrong, you'll disagree. The deciding factor is not who believes something. It's whether the idea survives your examination. That's what makes this trait rare. Most people don't consciously choose their beliefs one by one. They inherit them from family, culture, school, friends, social media, and the people they admire. They absorb opinions before they've developed the habit of questioning them. And because those beliefs become part of their identity, challenging the belief feels like challenging the person. That's why disagreement can become so emotional. You may simply be examining an idea while someone else feels like you're attacking them. The lone wolf thinker sees a distinction that many people miss. An idea is not a person. You can reject an idea without hating the person who holds it. You can change your mind without feeling humiliated. You can say, "I was wrong," without experiencing it as a collapse of your identity. That flexibility is a sign of intellectual strength. The goal isn't to always be right. The goal is to care more about what is true than about looking right, and that can make you uncomfortable in environments where everyone is expected to agree. You've probably experienced this before. A group is discussing something, everyone seems to have the same opinion, and you notice one detail that doesn't fit. You mention it and suddenly the conversation becomes awkward. Someone says you're overthinking. Someone tells you to relax. Someone says, "Why do you always make everything so complicated?" But you're not trying to make it complicated. You're trying to understand it accurately. Your mind doesn't like unfinished explanations. It wants to know what sits underneath the obvious answer. It wants the mechanism, not just the conclusion. That leads to sign number 2. You need solitude to think clearly, not simply to escape people. There's a difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the painful feeling of wanting connection and not having it. Solitude is the voluntary experience of being alone without feeling incomplete. The lone wolf thinker often needs solitude because their mind processes deeply. Conversations don't necessarily end when the conversation ends. You replay them. You connect details. You examine what was said, what wasn't said, why someone reacted the way they did, and what it might mean. A few hours alone can sometimes feel more productive than an entire day surrounded by noise. This is why constant social stimulation can exhaust you. It's not necessarily that you hate people. You may actually enjoy certain people deeply. What drains you is the continuous demand to respond, react, perform, and absorb information. When you're alone, you don't have to maintain a social version of yourself. You can think without interruption. You can read, walk, create, plan, analyze, sit in silence. Let your mind wander. And somewhere in that quiet, ideas begin connecting that you couldn't see while you were surrounded by noise. Most people are uncomfortable with silence. They reach for their phone, they turn on a video, they text someone, they need something happening around them. The lone wolf thinker can sit in a quiet room and eventually discover that silence isn't empty. It's where the internal conversation begins. And once you've learned to enjoy that space, you become less dependent on external stimulation. That's a form of psychological independence. You may even notice that your best ideas arrive when nobody is talking to you. On a walk, in the shower, late at night, driving alone, sitting by a window. The mind finally has enough room to connect information that was scattered throughout the day. That's why solitude isn't merely rest for you, it can be a laboratory. And this creates an interesting consequence. The more comfortable you become alone, the less willing you are to tolerate shallow company, simply to avoid being alone. That's where people may misunderstand you. They might say you're antisocial. They might ask why you don't go out more. They might wonder why you can disappear for days and seem perfectly fine. The answer is simple. Your internal world gives you something many people constantly seek outside themselves. But don't turn that into superiority. This is important. A lone wolf thinker who starts believing everyone else is stupid has stopped thinking independently and started building an ego around being different. That's not rare intelligence. That's another form of conformity, just wearing a different uniform. The healthiest independent thinkers remain curious. They know they can be wrong. They listen. They change their minds when evidence demands it. They don't need to feel superior to remain independent. Which brings us to sign number 3. You notice patterns in people that they don't realize they're showing you. You may walk into a room and immediately sense the tension. Someone says they're fine, but something about their voice tells you they're not. Someone compliments another person, but you notice the subtle resentment underneath it. Someone tells you a story, and you notice the part they conveniently left out. Someone claims they don't care, yet everything they do suggests they care deeply. You don't necessarily know exactly what the truth is, but you notice inconsistencies. This doesn't mean you have some supernatural ability to read minds. You don't. Nobody does. What you may have developed is a strong habit of observation. You pay attention to behavior, timing, tone, repetition, and contradiction. While other people are listening to what someone says, you're also noticing what they consistently do. And behavior is often more informative than language. People can say anything. They can promise, explain, apologize, compliment, reassure. But patterns are harder to fake over long periods. The person who claims to respect you but repeatedly ignores your boundaries is giving you information. The person who talks constantly about loyalty but disappears when you need them is giving you information. The person who says they're happy for you but consistently becomes distant whenever you succeed is giving you information. The lone wolf thinker often notices these things early because they don't only listen to the words, they observe the patterns surrounding the words. This can make relationships complicated. You may sometimes know something is wrong before you can explain why. You feel that something doesn't add up. Then months later, the evidence appears and you realize your original impression wasn't completely wrong. But be careful here. Intuition is not proof. A mature thinker treats intuition as a signal to investigate, not as a verdict. That's an important distinction. Your instincts can alert you to pay attention, but your judgment should still be based on evidence. This is where your independent mind becomes powerful. You don't have to accuse someone just because something feels strange. You can simply watch. You can let time reveal the pattern. You don't need to confront every inconsistency immediately. Sometimes the smartest move is to gather information before making a decision, and that leads directly into sign number 4. You are unusually comfortable with holding judgment until you understand the whole picture. In a world obsessed with instant opinions, this is rare. Something happens online and people immediately choose sides. Someone makes a mistake, and strangers instantly decide what kind of person they are. A relationship ends, and everyone wants to know who was the villain. A controversial event happens, and within minutes thousands of people have completely certain opinions. Your mind may resist that speed. You want context. What happened before? What happened afterward? What information is missing? What does each person gain from telling the story this way? Is there evidence? Could there be another explanation? That habit can make you appear indecisive to people who confuse speed with intelligence. But there's a difference between thinking slowly and thinking poorly. Sometimes taking longer to decide means you're actually processing more variables. A lone wolf thinker doesn't necessarily want the fastest answer. They want an answer that survives questioning. That's why you may occasionally frustrate people. They want you to pick a side, but you want more information. They want certainty, but you see complexity. They want a simple explanation, but you notice multiple causes. They want someone to blame, but you see the system that created the problem. This doesn't mean every situation is complicated. Sometimes the answer really is simple. The skill is knowing when simplicity is appropriate and when it is just laziness disguised as certainty. And here's something interesting. People may sometimes come to you when they need a perspective that isn't emotionally attached to the situation. You might be the friend who gets the late-night call because someone knows you'll actually listen. You might be the person at work who sees the problem nobody else noticed. You might be the one family member who doesn't immediately take sides. You become valuable because you can step outside the emotional current and look at the structure underneath it. But there is a downside. People may start using you as their unofficial therapist, strategist, problem solver, or emotional dumping ground. Because you listen deeply, people assume you have unlimited capacity. You don't. A lone wolf thinker needs boundaries just as much as anyone else. Your ability to understand someone doesn't mean you are responsible for fixing them, and that brings us to sign number 5. You would rather be alone than betray your own thinking. This may be the rarest sign of all. Most people fear social rejection more than they realize. They adjust their opinions depending on who is in the room. They laugh at jokes they don't find funny. They agree with things they don't believe. They stay quiet when they should speak because they don't want to become the odd one out. The lone wolf thinker may experience the same pressure, but eventually something inside says, "No, I can't pretend." You may have lost friendships because you refused to participate in something that felt wrong. You may have walked away from groups that required you to become someone you weren't. You may have chosen a less popular path because it made more sense to you. You may have been called stubborn when what you really were was unwilling to betray your own judgment. That can be lonely, but there's a strange freedom on the other side of it. When you stop needing everyone to approve of your choices, you become incredibly difficult to control. Flattery loses some of its power. Peer pressure loses some of its power. Fear of being left out loses some of its power. The threat of being misunderstood loses some of its power. You can finally make decisions based on what you believe is right, rather than what will receive the most applause. That is independence. And it's why the lone wolf metaphor resonates with people. The wolf isn't powerful because it hates the pack. It is powerful because it can survive outside the pack when necessary. The healthiest version of the lone wolf doesn't reject connection. It simply refuses to become helpless without it. You can have people you love and still maintain your individuality. You can be part of a team without surrendering your judgment. You can be in a relationship without losing your identity. You can listen to advice without becoming dependent on approval. You can belong without disappearing into the group. That's the real goal. Because there's another trap waiting for people who identify too strongly with being a lone wolf. Isolation can become an identity. You can start telling yourself, "Nobody understands me," and then unconsciously reject anyone who tries. You can turn independence into emotional armor. You can use solitude to avoid vulnerability. You can call yourself self-sufficient when you're actually afraid of needing anyone. That's not the rare mind. That's avoidance. The truly independent thinker can do something much harder. Choose connection without surrendering independence. They can say, "I don't need you to complete me, but I value having you in my life." They can say, "I can survive alone, but I don't have to reject people simply because I can." They can trust selectively. They can be vulnerable intentionally. They can accept help without feeling weak. They can admit when they don't know something. They can change their mind without feeling defeated. That's psychological strength. And perhaps this is why lone wolf thinkers sometimes feel misunderstood from an early age. As a child, you may have been told you were too quiet, too serious, too sensitive, too stubborn, too independent. You may have preferred one close friend over a huge group. You may have asked questions adults didn't expect. You may have noticed tensions in your family that nobody talked about. You may have spent more time observing than participating. People often interpret unfamiliar behavior using familiar categories. Quiet becomes shy. Independent becomes antisocial. Analytical becomes cold. Selective becomes arrogant. Introspective becomes distant. But labels don't explain a person. Patterns do. And if you recognize yourself in these signs, don't rush to turn them into an identity that makes you feel special. Use them as an invitation to understand yourself better. Ask yourself why you question things. Ask yourself why solitude restores you. Ask yourself what patterns you notice in people. Ask yourself whether you genuinely seek truth or simply seek evidence that you're right. Ask yourself whether your independence comes from strength or fear. Those questions will tell you more than any personality label ever could, because the rare mind isn't the mind that knows everything, it's the mind that knows it doesn't. A lone wolf thinker understands that certainty can be dangerous when it becomes ego. They remain curious, they read things they disagree with, they talk to people outside their worldview, they listen to criticism, they test their assumptions. They aren't afraid to discover that an idea they've held for years was wrong. That's the paradox of genuine independent thinking. The stronger your identity becomes, the less you need every belief to protect your ego. You can say, I don't know. You can say, I was wrong. You can say, I need more information. You can say, I changed my mind. Those aren't signs of weakness. They're signs that your mind belongs to you. And there is another characteristic you may recognize. You often prefer depth over quantity. You don't necessarily want dozens of conversations. You want one conversation that actually means something. You don't need hundreds of acquaintances. You'd rather have two people you can speak honestly with. Small talk can feel exhausting because your mind naturally wants to move towards something real. What do you believe? What are you building? What are you afraid of? What have you learned? What actually matters? This doesn't mean small talk is useless. Social rituals have their place. But your mind may naturally search for substance beneath them, and because of that you can sometimes feel like you're surrounded by people but still mentally alone. You're hearing words, but you're not encountering much depth. You're participating in conversations, but you're not feeling understood. The solution isn't to conclude that nobody is worth knowing. The solution is to find the people capable of meeting you at that depth. They're out there. They may simply be rarer. And ironically, the more comfortable you become with solitude, the better your relationships can become, because you stop entering them from desperation. You don't need someone to save you from your own company. You choose people because their presence genuinely improves your life. That's a completely different foundation, and it changes the type of person you attract. When you don't desperately need approval, manipulative people have less leverage. When you don't fear solitude, you can leave unhealthy relationships. When you don't need constant validation, flattery becomes less powerful. When you can think independently, group pressure becomes less effective. When you observe patterns, inconsistencies become easier to detect. When you have strong internal standards, people have to meet them rather than simply convince you with words. This is why independent thinking can become a form of psychological protection. But don't confuse protection with paranoia. A lone wolf thinker should not assume everyone has hidden motives. That's another form of mental captivity. If you start seeing manipulation everywhere, you aren't free. You're simply controlled by suspicion instead of approval. The goal is neither blind trust nor constant distrust. It's discernment. Trust when evidence supports trust. Step back when patterns demand caution. Give people room to prove themselves. And remember that a mistake in judgment doesn't mean your entire worldview was wrong. You will sometimes trust the wrong person. You will sometimes misread a situation. You will sometimes follow an idea that turns out to be false. That's part of being human. The rare mind isn't the mind that never gets fooled. It's the mind that learns. It updates. It becomes wiser without becoming bitter. That's the difference between experience and trauma. Experience teaches you how to navigate. Bitterness teaches you to expect danger everywhere. Don't let disappointment destroy your curiosity. Don't let betrayal destroy your capacity for connection. Don't let being misunderstood convince you that nobody is capable of understanding you. And don't let your identity as a lone wolf become an excuse to never grow beyond your comfort zone. The strongest lone wolf thinker isn't the person hiding from the world. It's the person who can enter the world without losing themselves. They can walk into a crowded room and remain themselves. They can hear hundreds of opinions and still think independently. They can receive criticism without collapsing. They can receive praise without becoming addicted to it. They can be alone without feeling abandoned. They can be loved without becoming dependent. They can be rejected without becoming destroyed. They can change without losing their identity. That's rare. And if you recognize these traits in yourself, perhaps the most important thing you can do is stop treating your differences as defects. Your need for solitude may be a need for restoration. Your questioning may be intellectual independence. Your observation may be emotional awareness. Your patience may be discernment. Your willingness to stand alone may be self-respect. But every strength becomes dangerous when taken to an extreme. Solitude can become isolation. Observation can become overthinking. Independence can become emotional avoidance. Skepticism can become cynicism. Self-respect can become arrogance. So don't just ask whether you have the traits of a lone wolf thinker. Ask whether you're using them wisely. Are you alone because you genuinely enjoy solitude, or because you're afraid of being vulnerable? Are you skeptical because you value truth, or because trusting anyone feels dangerous? Are you independent because you're strong, or because asking for help feels like weakness? Are you observant because you're thoughtful, or because you're constantly looking for reasons not to trust? Those questions separate genuine psychological strength from a defense mechanism. And perhaps that's the final lesson. You don't have to choose between being independent and being connected. You don't have to choose between solitude and friendship. You don't have to choose between strength and vulnerability. You can have both. You can be the lone wolf who still knows when to walk with others. You can be independent without becoming isolated. You can be thoughtful without becoming paralyzed by overthinking. You can question the crowd without automatically opposing it. You can trust slowly without becoming incapable of trust. You can protect your peace without building a prison around yourself. So if you've spent your life wondering why you feel different, maybe the answer isn't that you're broken. Maybe your mind simply doesn't work on autopilot. Maybe you need more time to process. Maybe you notice patterns other people overlook. Maybe you value depth over popularity. Maybe you need solitude to hear your own thoughts. Maybe you're willing to stand alone when everyone else is moving in the opposite direction. If that's you, don't waste your life trying to become easier for everyone else to understand. Learn yourself instead. Strengthen your judgment. Protect your solitude. Choose your people carefully. Stay curious. Stay humble. And never confuse being alone with being less valuable. Because the rarest person in the room isn't always the loudest. Sometimes it's the person sitting quietly in the corner, watching, thinking, questioning, connecting dots nobody else has noticed yet. The person who doesn't need to be heard immediately because they're still figuring out what is actually worth saying. The person who can walk away from the crowd without hatred. The person who can stand alone without falling apart. The person who doesn't need everyone to agree with them before they trust their own mind. That's the lone wolf thinker. And if you recognized yourself in these 5 signs, don't take it as proof that you're better than everyone else. Take it as a responsibility. Because an independent mind is powerful only when it remains honest. Question everything, but question yourself too. Trust your intuition, but verify it. Protect your solitude, but don't hide inside it. Stand alone when necessary, but don't reject people who genuinely deserve a place beside you. And most importantly, never surrender your ability to think simply because belonging feels easier. Because the world doesn't always need another person who follows the noise. Sometimes it needs someone who can step away from it, think clearly, see what others missed, and then choose their own direction. And maybe that's why you've always felt a little different. You weren't necessarily meant to follow the crowd. You were meant to understand yourself well enough to decide when to walk with it and when to walk alone.